Hey, it's Lou here with our third and final episode in this special series of conversations from Shade, supported by Hauser and Wirth, where we'll be exploring unencumbered voices in curated spaces, inspired by the life and the work of Sir Frank Bowling.
It was the first time in my life that I had the opportunity to get down and do what I wanted to do. I mean, like I'm 24, and I had the most marvelous, satisfying experience. But I mean, that was one of the moments in my life when I knew what I wanted to do, how I was going to go about it, etc.
And released throughout this summer, the series provides a collaborative platform for diverse perspectives, investigating freedom of expression today and throughout art history. And today, my guest is Thomas J. Price.
The characters I sculpt, they don't look for validation because I don't want to play that game. They're not real people because I don't want to play that game. It's about making a statement of, I feel that model's defunct and has never really served anyone properly because it ultimately serves up lies or PR, because statues have been PR since they've begun.
Born in London in 1981, Thomas studied at Chelsea College of Art and the Royal College of Art in London. He works across disciplines, predominantly in sculpture, but also in film and photography. His large-scale sculptures depict imagined subjects whose features are an amalgamation of sources. Observed individuals and stereotypes represented in the media are mixed with references to ancient, classical and neoclassical sculptures. These works serve as psychological portraits of the viewer by revealing socially learned attitudes and understandings as they project identities onto the depicted characters. This is a beautiful conversation that I had with Thomas for our final episode in this series, so let's go to the conversation. Enjoy. Thank you so much for joining me today for this series, Thomas, to talk about freedom of expression, which is inspired by the life and work of Sir Frank Bowling. It's just a real joy to have you here.
Well, thank you for inviting me on. I really appreciate it.
I've enjoyed spending time reading and listening to your interviews that you've done in relation to your exhibited work, and it's made me think a lot about the artist's statement. It's kind of like an informal contract, really, because it's like making a statement about your work, and that's between the artist and the establishment and the audience. It's a secondary expression of the work that they are required to do. Sometimes it's media interactions like this interview and also I've been teaching some students at Central St Martin's about communication and the art of communication and communicating your ideas to an audience, and quite naturally they're completely adverse to the idea of the artist statement. The work speaks for itself, we are visual people, and I'm like, you are, but there's also this world in which we work where this is required of us at times, and I've just been really thinking about how that might sort of affect our freedom. I was also thinking about how Naomi Osaka, the tennis player, has made a stand at the moment to say, I'm not doing this anymore. It's not benefiting anyone. It's not benefiting the work or the audience. And I just wonder now, because, you've been used to being involved in interviews and sharing your work and having dialogue with galleries for many years now, a couple of decades. And I just wonder how you started while I was reading about Licht. You started that in 2001, so that's 20 years ago.
Yeah, I know. I started young.
Yeah. So I just wonder how all of this has kind of played out for you over the years as your work has gained more attention.
I mean, that's a really interesting question to try and answer, actually. Thank you. I mean, I understand Naomi's position to some extent. I think it's really an indicator of the level of questioning she's receiving and where the press, the media, in relation to her are, where their interest lies. And because some of the things that I've seen written about her, some of the, that cartoon, was it an Australian newspaper, have just been absolutely offensive. And I think, as in literally, I would say racist.
Yeah.
And to have to deal with, being a professional, absolute top level athlete and all that demands, and then have to deal with that side of things as well as an added pressure that other players aren't having to deal with, I think is disgraceful. And so I totally understand her stance, and actually having to make such a strong statement to actually possibly be listened to, in one sense. So I think it's a really sad situation that she's been forced into, where her mental health is put secondary to selling newspapers. But back to the artist's statement, I think, that it's an interesting one, and it does change over time. I think the most truthful answer to this would be that there's a development to the answer, really, and it changes as you kind of progress or move through your practice, your career, and you start to build up an understanding of your practice within the public consciousness. And with an audience. So when I was a student, I actually one of the sort of the strategies I used when actually making my work was to not explain everything and to try to guide everyone through or be didactic about it, because I wanted people to bring themselves to the work. I wanted people to reveal themselves through their examination and their ruminations on what I was presenting. And so for me to say, well, the work is this and this and this and this, would be to cut that opportunity off and to pretty much help them avoid tackling the things that I was trying to get them to tackle. And it was very much from that perspective, as in I was trying to get an audience, which I knew was predominantly white, to look at the things that I was being approached with in terms of questions around my work. And so instead of resolving everything for them and presenting it as signed, sealed and delivered, it was, I think, placing the onus on them to expose a little bit of themselves and perhaps feel a bit uncomfortable and realize that that's okay. And that's part of this process that we call making artworks. So, it's that was where I was at. And then as people start to realize, the meanings in the work or the approach you take to the work, and they're able to reference a new piece to an old piece or one show to another show, it wasn't feasible to remain silent. That wasn't the best tactic or strategy to really get that communication out there in the best way possible. And that's what, I think a lot of artists are looking for. At least I know I'm looking for that in my work, is to communicate with, in some sense, an imagined audience, but increasingly, with a real measurable audience in terms of reviews or critics or public opinion, even your peers, So it became sort of as my understanding of my practice grew, because let's not forget the fact that, particularly as a student, you're really starting things for the first time, and you might not have the words. The expectation that an artist who is often predominantly expresses themselves visually or through kind of sort of tangible means should also be a wordsmith.
Absolutely.
It's a bit. It seems to be more of a modern. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to be more of a modern kind of criteria because of the way that we disseminate information. So these social media platforms where now everybody is not just an artist, but you're an influencer, or you're supposed to update people every day with what you're doing and have profound thoughts on it. But I think it was really important to acknowledge that there should be that space and that time at the beginning of ideas to allow for an openness and an ambiguity and a development through through this kind of feedback, the sensory feedback, not just through words. So I think that was when I recognized that, okay, so I've got past that initial stage of what is this work, I basically let the circumstances lead it, in as much as it became increasingly obvious to me that I had to speak up more clearly and directly about what my work was, because other people were trying to interpret it in the easiest way possible. And what I've always wanted with my work is that it's not easy. So you might think it's easy, as in like someone approaches it, and for example, for the kind of the things that are very figurative, go, well, that's a person, that must be of someone particular, and then it's to kind of it was up to me to actually say, well, this is a made up individual.
Yeah.
And to reference then why the choice of materials, why choice of scale, why the fictional figure, why the fictional character, what the mode of presentation meant. So you basically start to guide people down the path where they are then able to have those building blocks to then form better understandings, and hopefully to present those understandings to other people, so that you get to expand this zone of influence that the work has, and instead of sort of compounding misunderstandings, I guess.
Absolutely. I completely understand that. And the reason why I asked that is because, Frank was so clear about how he wanted his work to be referenced. And it just really made me think so much, as, especially if the work is coming from a Black or brown artist, an artist of color, or if you're a queer artist, well, then it's queer art,
Absolutely.
And
everyone's work's about feminism, and it's just like
yeah, absolutely. I had the same when I started my career as a photographer. I mean, it's just so wild to me that 20 years ago that I was such an anomaly as a mixed race female photographer, and I was taking pictures of other women, and people were constantly asking me if I was gay. I was like, why are you asking me that? I'm taking work about my experience. I am a woman. It doesn't mean that it was just so binary and banal. And so I can see why, you need to come in sometimes, and you do need to help frame the conversations that people are having, and the identities that people are putting on your own work that just simply don't exist.
Well, this is it. I think at the beginning it's useful or interesting because they expose themselves.
Yes.
They expose their schemas, their attitudes, their understandings.
Yeah.
But then it's how far do you want to allow that misunderstanding to deviate you, or the understanding, your general understanding of your work, from the real understanding. One of the defining points, I think, in my practice was when I presented an animation and it was only seen as a Black man. This script of black before everything. And then you notice that in newspaper articles, you notice that in like when just people are, in a pub are talking to you, describing someone. And so, I created these animations that are called Man 1, Man 2, Man 3, to remove that descriptor. And because my work has always been about being human, not about being black, And I think it was very hard for people to actually get past that initial point.
I was thinking about your use of language in terms of the titles of your work, and how there seems to be like an absence of formalized language or labeling. I started off by thinking about Licht, which we've talked about, and that's one of your early works, where you painted a gallery wall using your tongue as a communication tool, but not using it for words. And then I was thinking of how you use the term psychological propositions that your sculptures are offering. They're sculptures of everyday men and women that reject the normal kind of messaging that we see in statues, where public spaces and statues in public spaces, the characters or the people that we see are usually communicating in quite a bombastic and direct and sort of overpowering way. They're supposed heroes, and yours are the polar opposite of that. Yours is so quiet and it's so expressive. And you said in an interview that often the most powerful person in the room is the person in the background who's fiddling, or not sitting bolt upright, smiling, or putting on a face for an audience. And I just thought that was so interesting. And I think because as a photographer and a dyslexic myself, I only now realize in hindsight that I was using my images to communicate in a way that I just couldn't communicate in any other way at the time. And it's just crazy that I've ended up doing podcasting, because I find words extremely difficult. That's why I have to write everything
but maybe that's
down.
why they're so interesting to you.
Oh, well, I just it's just so much easier for me to communicate through imagery, and understand the world through imagery. But I just wondered what led you into choosing the line that you chose to follow towards sculpture.
Again, another really interesting one. Well, I do find language incredibly interesting and exciting. And I think within my practice, this idea of not reserve, but basically creating this tension or this density through resisting putting everything in. This idea of not presenting the word so that, again, someone has to fill the space. A bit like the eyes in the sculptures I make of these people. They're hollowed out. It's like, because I want people to fill that space with themselves. So with Licht, Licht was a piece which started out with the intention of one thing and became something else. And so initially it was supposed to be an invisible piece of work, which was going to kind of operate in two ways. It was going to be this idea of this performance of me licking a room. The resulting installation was going to be an empty room that you could walk into, and then the question would be, could you, as in the viewer, get a sense of somebody in there with you? Like, would people be able to pick up on the kind of my pheromones or kind of the chemicals of my saliva to kind of get almost like a ghost presence of me in this room? And obviously, well, as I started to lick this room, about a couple of hours in, I thought this room was just getting dirty, the wall was getting dirty, but in fact, within another half an hour, I realized my tongue was bleeding, and it just became increasingly more bloody. And so this piece, which was going to be quite a minimalist sort of, not a quiet joke, but this sort of, the art is very much in a position of power, of knowing, and then the viewer guessing. It became inverted, where the artist, as in I was then licking this room, leaving a very visible trail. So where people could go and see this, me literally putting my inner self onto the walls. Yeah. So it became this very visual record of this endeavor, I guess, in a sense, to try and connect to people, trying to connect the inner self, or a sense of the inner self, to an audience, and to talk about how interpersonal kind of relationships happen or don't happen, the misfires. And I think that's sort of where my interest in the actual figures came in. It was to kind of talk about from the outside, how does that affect what we think? How does our interpretation of a visual set of cues, which I'd call this psychological proposition, this idea of, because these figures are all fictional and they're constructed, I would say, like kind of around an emotional framework, but they're constructed by me, in my head, and then either in clay or on a computer, and then back into clay, to try to stimulate particular responses, or to try to talk about certain set of features, this idea of physiognomy, which has been profiled in a particular way in media and film and society, to try and present that in this new kind of format. I say new, but this idea of figurative sculpture and statuary is very, very old. So, but to present these images of Black people, essentially, in this way, which doesn't play up to the expected tropes of either being, an actual individual from history who's been very successful, successful at like plundering other lands, or, often people think the people I present, particularly the men, are sports people. Oh, right. Because why else would they be put in this material or this scale? Yeah. And so that's, again, I find that very interesting. And so this idea of this psychological proposition is really about, asking the viewer, what do you see? Bring your references to this. This is an opportunity for you to pick apart the schemas of understandings that you have, or have been, had taught to you, these attitudes that have been instilled in you. And in that way, it kind of talks about society or societies, and how we are encouraged and sort of molded to think about people in certain ways, and how we often distance ourselves from people. Absolutely. And so I want to talk about those distances, and I think that's where scale comes in, to my work, is to actually think about this idea of status, so using scale to denote or to play with this idea of status, using scale to talk about distance, or how one physically approaches a sculpture. So I always say these are sculptures about statues. Yeah. So they're not, for me, because of thinking, or the starting point, or the ambition for them is so different to what statues do. This idea of puffing up your chest, or showing how much better you are than the masses. Well, I try and pluck images which would be within the masses, and place them in this material at certain scales, so that we, the viewers, get to consider or reconsider our value systems and what we have come to expect. Because I think even the people who might recognize themselves in the sculptures, they don't necessarily, they don't expect to see themselves there. They, in fact, sometimes I find playing with these expectations that society has for individuals within it, and how those expectations differ depending on who you are or who you are seen to be, that is at the crux of a lot of my work, which deals with the figure. But yeah, I mean, I've always thought of my work as my whole practice as like this iceberg, and only certain parts are exposed at one time. There's a whole sort of body of work which supports these little bits that kind of come to the top.
What's interesting to me about that, you're describing the characters, and people are saying, well, why are they there? They must,
Yeah.
he must be a sports hero. And I'm thinking about traditional statues. We've been so trained in how to view them over the centuries and how to respond to them. These figures usually demand our respect, our attention, and our awe, even if we don't know really who they are. That's just the way that the statues take up the public spaces. You've chosen Black characters. They're not demanding, they're not engaging in the way, they're demanding a response. I'm going to be here, I exist, however you are viewing me. And there's like an absence of the need for validation in your characters. I find that so interesting. They're taking up space in a public space. And I think that's quite a big statement.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the, one of the main points that I think my work, my practice carries with it. And I think it goes back to actually even this artist statement, this idea of this contract or this agreement, this understanding an artist has with the viewer. This idea that, well, okay, if you're going to place a work in the public realm at a certain size and in a particular material, so you're going to put a large bronze figure, for example, outside, it better be of someone worth my time. It better be of someone who I could then go, maybe even begrudgingly, but okay, they're better than I am, or they've done more than me, and therefore they deserve. In my opinion, I can understand why they're there, in that material. But so when I take characters that don't even exist, it's not even a person that they can reference in history to say this is why they have the thing that that they're in this position that you're not in. It disrupts the understandings we have, or the kind of the way that we have made sense of the world, in terms of hierarchy and status. It disrupts that story that we have either been told or we then tell ourselves as to why certain people have more of something. So when you see someone who's in bronze, who you think was just as good as, I'm just as good as them, or it can anger people in some ways. Absolutely. Or it can make people think, oh look, there I am. And I think some of the most powerful moments I've had is when I put works in the public. And I think there was like two families that came running up to a piece, an aluminium, like these heads on marble bases called Newman pieces. And they said, oh, there we are. These kids were saying that, and they were touching the heads, and they felt they saw themselves presented in a way that they could celebrate. And I kind of loved that sort of the idea that you don't quite know how people are going to receive these works, but they're often confounded by the what is this?
Absolutely. And I'm wondering now that because we're seeing such a like a widespread critiquing of statues currently, we are kind of, as a society, becoming more aligned with the message that you've had all along, that you've been communicating. There's an elevated social consciousness that's happening around public art and specifically sculptures. And I'm just wondering if that mass consciousness will affect the way that you critique.
I would say that the most important thing has been the interest in the histories of these figures.
Yes.
Not just in the statues themselves. Because if I'm absolutely honest, I still think there's a huge difference between how I approach these kind of the idea of a statue, or what a statue could be in my sculpture, compared to perhaps what's being proposed now. So I feel that what's happened is people have gone, look, we've had all these slave owners, all these horrendous generals, these people who have got really, horrible track records of how they've treated human beings, or the things they've done in their lives. Why are we celebrating them? Let's celebrate, and then they put in someone else's name.
Yes.
So let's celebrate another individual. And I guess what I've been saying is, is the idea of celebrating an individual something that we even should be doing? or is that something that should be the ideal? Is that the thing that should that be the pinnacle? Like, I certainly don't believe in taking all the statues down or never putting up a statue of someone else again. What happens when you go, okay, well, let's pick out someone from history who, okay, let's pick out, I don't know, a person of color from history who's invented something.
Yeah.
I think in terms of education, it would be so good if that was taught in the educational system, so that we had a proper understanding of that, what that person contributed and all the other people who have been overlooked. But ultimately, when you start playing their game with statues, you're on their continuum, which they ultimately control. And so they, and I'm talking about they as in like the institutions or the government, who are clearly against any real change when it comes to presentations of these historical figures. They know that ultimately they can shift things back down that continuum again to how they've always been.
Yeah.
Because it's the same game that they control. And I guess this idea of, from the question you asked previously, or the point you made previously about this looking for validation, the characters I sculpt, they don't look for validation because I don't want to play that game. They're not real people because I don't want to play that game. It's about making this statement of this idea that I feel that model's defunct and has never really served anyone properly, because it ultimately serves up lies, or PR, because statues have been PR since they've begun.
Yeah.
And so, do you want to get into that kind of PR game, or do you want to draw people's attention to the things that we've been taught, perhaps, which aren't true? And then do we want to make sure that people have the education and the information in order to present the real stories and to understand the potential that we as individuals have to create, a better future, one where, we don't really rely on statues because there's knowledge out there.
Absolutely. And I think that's also another reason why artists as well as activists and are kind of becoming more and more of a threat to like the status quo at the moment, and it's just
that's why I'm trying to cut all the funding.
Yeah, exactly. It's really affecting the funding, and it's just crazy. And it's because of the voice and the effect of that this work can have, And my last question to round up, I want to loop back to this idea of freedom again, of expression, and I just think choosing the route of being an artist, right? That's an interesting and sometimes challenging one.
It's pure madness.
Yeah, enough in its own right. But then, putting your work into curated spaces where the majority of the time, the audience has chosen to place themselves there. They've made a choice to look at the work, but still, that is still quite a vulnerable space to be in,
For sure.
I know what that feeling's like.
Yeah.
I just really like to end by asking how you mentally approach these kind of projects. What advice would you give to emerging artists who will need to talk about their work, who will need to get used to that feeling of their work being out there on a consistent basis? And really, it's about sharing their intimate interactions with the world in public spaces.
Yeah. As soon as you feel really comfortable in something, that for me is always the marker of, right, I need to expand. I need to do something else. If there's not that little feeling of discomfort in terms of, is this going to work? Or, have I answered all the questions I was trying to ask, then, So I think it's really important, whether you're, in making art or just living your life, really, is to make sure you kind of push your comfort zones. The thing I've always tried to do is, extending from that, is to just really be truthful with myself. That's why I got into the art in the first place, because I was truthful about what are the things I'm actually good at. I wanted to be lots of things when I was younger. And I sort of found myself as an artist because it fitted in with how I thought, I'm massively dyslexic myself. So how I approach the world, it's never A to B. It's always like, through every other letter before you get there. But the big thing is to really be truthful with yourself, feel the fear and do it anyway, but also to really try and maintain that quality of interrogation. As in, like, it's a tricky one. It's basically, is this as good as I can do it?
Yeah.
It's as simple as that, I guess. Is this the best it can be? And if it's not, it either means you get to make another piece of work, or it means you get to rework what you're doing. Because ultimately, when you go to yourself, yes, this is the best as it can be, then any criticism or any comments you get, whether that's in a gallery space, which can be just as cutting, well, okay, but at least you know that is, you've approached this part of your practice, this particular work, this show, whatever it is, you've left nothing behind. You put it all out there. And I think that is the pact that I at least make with this imagined audience, is that I'm going to do everything I can to give you the all I have, the best that I have, and then the rest is up to you. I do love the public realm because people are so brutally honest, and you're in their house basically. That's the contract you have with them, is that you've put work in their way. It might be on their daily route to work. It might be in their park. Who knows? So you're in their space, their house. So they're going to tell you what they think. And I like that kind of that high jeopardy element of it. It's a different type of conversation, which might not be art speak, but sometimes it's that clarity, that incisiveness is refreshing.
Absolutely. So speak your truth, like in everything we say.
Oh, you just summed it up way better. Yeah, that's what. Can I go back and say, speak your truth?
Speak your truth. Yeah. Well, that's just a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Thomas.
That's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. I really do appreciate it.
This series, inspired by the work of Frank Bowling, is sponsored by Hauser and Wirth. Editing and mixing is by C.A. Davis, and music is by Brian Jackson. If this conversation has inspired you to explore the work of Frank Bowling more, I've added links to his work in the episode's description. And come and say hi to Shade on Instagram at @shade_podcast and on Twitter at @shadepodcast1. And check out our website too for all of the episode archives. I've been your host, Lou Menser, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.